My name is Manfred Helber. I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in the category Cloud and Data Center. Let's first talk about Azure Kubernetes Services and Azure Kubernetes Services on Azure Stack HCI a little bit. Azure Kubernetes Services is available in Azure since several years already. So we have the Azure Kubernetes Services in Azure Stack HCI and in Azure in the public data centers. And in the first version of Azure Stack HCI, we also have support for Azure Kubernetes Services on Azure Stack HCI. What does this mean? Our platform for running this orchestration for containers is an Azure Stack HCI cluster. The Azure Stack HCI cluster, we have learned about this in several modules. We can start with 2 server nodes. We can scale up to 16 server nodes. We can have several of these clusters. When we use Azure Kubernetes Services in Azure Public Cloud at Microsoft, we only consume the services. In Azure Stack HCI, we also have to think about how the Azure Kubernetes services are provided on premises. The good news is that there's a configuration wizard in the Windows Admin Center portal that provides the necessary configuration steps for Azure Kubernetes services. For Azure Kubernetes services, we need the Azure Kubernetes Services Platform Services. These are Hyper-V virtual machines that provide the system services with the containers. Kubernetes services that we talk about containerized workloads. In the Kubernetes cluster itself, we have the control plane and the worker nodes. The control plane consists of Hyper-V VMs with system services that talk to the system services of the Azure Kubernetes Services Platform Services. This control plane also communicates with the worker nodes on our Azure Stack HCI cluster. When we spoke about licensing of Azure Stack HCI and workloads, we have seen costs for Azure Kubernetes Services on Azure Stack HCI, and there we had the information that we only pay for the worker nodes. So these are the nodes we pay for and where we can take the advantage of hyper-threading without paying for these logical CPUs. So the Kubernetes cluster is customer hosted. So we can provide the services on premises. This is great when we want to optimize latency, when we want to access local stored databases and things like this. The configuration of this whole Azure Stack HCI based Kubernetes cluster is provided by Windows Admin Center. So Windows Admin Center provides a dedicated Azure Kubernetes Services configuration wizard. And this wizard is similar to what we know from the Azure Stack HCI deployment wizard itself. It knows several steps. It checks the prerequisites, configures the basics, the node pools, the authentication, the networking, the integration, and to finalize it, we have a preview and create step. First step is to configure the connectivity to Azure. This has to be enabled, and we need an Azure account. We select for an Azure subscription, and we decide for a resource group. We can create new resource groups or use existing. In the cluster details, we have information about the Kubernetes services host. We have a host username, so our administrator typically, and we specify a password. And we have the Kubernetes cluster name and the version we can select here. So there are different Kubernetes versions supported for deployment. In the next step, in the node pools, we can create one or more node pools for specific containers or containerized services. Here, for example, we can see we have a Linux pool, OS type is Linux, and we have a node size. The node size is responsible for pricing. In the docs.microsoft.com, we can read details about pricing deployment this here. The authentication is clear. The important step is the networking, because also these containerized workloads need some network access. So we will add network interfaces where we have a virtual network name that's connected with a virtual switch. We can decide for networking static or DHCP, and in the configuration options, we have the IP address, prefix, the default gateway address, DNS server, Kubernetes node pool start address, Kubernetes node pool end address, and the IP pool start address for the IP address templates for the virtual IP address pool. When we switch to DHCP, we have only the start and the add address and then VLAN ID for the virtual LANs. In the preview and create step, we have an final information about what will be created, and via clicking on create, it will be deployed. Here we can see the reason why I worked with screenshot. It takes very long to click through this wizard, and the deployment also needs a lot of additional time on your cluster, but everything is configured by this wizard. So you save a lot of time in using this wizard, but you should plan some time for deploying your Azure Kubernetes cluster on Azure Stack HCI. We have a very good documentation about Azure Kubernetes Services on Azure Stack HCI on docs.microsoft.com. So if you are working with containers, you have information there about the networking configuration, the deployment of AKS host workload clusters with PowerShell, about deploying using Windows Admin Center, about creating the Kubernetes clusters, and then preparing applications, creating container registries, and so on. If you are familiar with container technologies, you will find your way here to deploy your own Kubernetes cluster. It's an option. It's an option like all the other hybrid services for Azure Stack HCI we have. And we had several modules about hybrid services and configuring hybrid services in this video series. And I think it's important to understand this. This is a key value of Azure Stack HCI, because Microsoft promises us that we will have today and in the future a lot of Azure workloads and benefits on Azure Stack HCI, Azure management and governance, and the infrastructure innovations. And some of these services we have already seen. So we talked about Windows Server 2022 Azure Edition. This is one of these hybrid workloads. Initially, this is only available in the Azure data centers, but because Azure Stack HCI is Azure, we have also this Azure Edition on Azure Stack HCI. The extended security updates we discussed. Windows subscription add-on we have seen in one live demo. Azure Virtual Desktop for Azure Stack HCI, there we had a video module about it. We will see continuous Kubernetes innovations. I didn't mention this when we talked about Kubernetes in this module. For Azure Stack HCI, we have a new version every year. Once a year, we will see a new version. This is the promise. Maybe we have sometimes 2 versions a year, but I expect 1 version each year. For Kubernetes cluster services, we have new versions every month. It's a total different world when you're working with containers. And here we have a continuous innovation for this Kubernetes services on Azure Stack HCI. We have the Arc-enabled platform as a services. We have the integration with the Azure Resource Manager. If you are working with Resource Manager templates, this is an absolute hybrid topics. We have the extensions and Azure Arc-enabled servers. We have a preview of multi-cluster monitoring for Azure Stack HCI. If you have several of these clusters, remember we configured Azure Monitor, but this multi-cluster monitoring is in preview actually. We have the Arc-enabled virtual machine management via the Windows Admin Center. We have seen in one module Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery and Arc-enabled Kubernetes services. We discussed about GPU workloads in the hardware requirements. The restart is much faster. We have intent-driven cluster networking. We have seen this in the deployment with it. We have the SYN provisioning for storage spaces direct. This is also a hybrid feature because this is driven by Azure. Yes, it runs on premises, but it's driven by Azure. Also the dynamic processor compatibility and the secured core server functionality. So we will take advantage of this Azure-driven additional values we will also receive in Azure Stack HCI. Important is to understand that Azure Stack HCI is the only platform that provides this exclusive integration. Some of these things we also see in Windows Server. So for example, Kubernetes clusters can be deployed on Windows Server and on Windows Server based clusters. We can Arc-enable Windows servers. But we have exclusive features like Azure Edition, like free extended security updates, like Windows Server subscription add-on, like Azure Virtual Desktop for HCI. And when you want to have the full hybrid stack, then it's important to understand that you have to choose and decide for Azure Stack HCI because this is the only platform that can provide you these full hybrid capabilities on premises. No other operating system can this, no other Microsoft operating system, and no other third-party operating system.